Max was born into a rather poor family. His parents did not particularly expect the appearance of a child, and therefore treated the boy very negatively. From childhood, he had to endure various mockery, ridicule, and not only from the parents, but also from peers. And it began in kindergarten, where the boy first learned about child cruelty. Max did not yet realize how difficult and cruel the world is in relation to a small defenseless child. He went to an ordinary kindergarten, but because of his appearance and not particularly attractive appearance, he had no friends. And one day, coming to the kindergarten, he saw the accusing look of the teacher, and then he heard, "And why is he taken to our kindergarten? We have normal children, and here he brings this one. How many times can you do it? He spoils the whole image of our kindergarten. He's a scum of the earth." The teacher's voice was rude and arrogant. She was talking to the nanny, even though the boy was staring at her in incomprehension. Max continued to stare at the woman until she suddenly shifted her gaze to him, saying, "What are you looking at me for? You're ashamed to even be allowed in the group with ordinary children. It would be better if you were not brought to our kindergarten at all." She turned back to her partner, ignoring the tears in Max's eyes. The boy, though he didn't understand half of what was said, he still felt that he wasn't welcome. The strange pinching feeling inside was getting stronger and stronger. It seemed that here and now tears would start to roll out of his eyes in hot paths. But Max did his best to hold back his impulse. He looked at the teacher for a few seconds and then went to the group. Immediately the taunts from the children started coming in his direction. At 6 years old they were already cruel enough, and therefore they did not miss the opportunity to tease the boy. No one liked him from the group, and he was well aware that over the years the relationship would only get worse. Max didn't want to go to school with these kids and continue to socialize closely with them after years of constant bullying. No one asks you what you want and what you don't want. "Honey," replied Pam angrily to her son. She looked at the boy with the bottle in her hand with displeasure. Clearly not thrilled to be talking to her son. There was hatred in her eyes and a certain irritation that was impossible not to notice. "You will go to the school I tell you to go to. And if you don't like it, you can go to your stupid daddy. He'll give you a sweet life." The woman, clearly not wanting to continue the conversation with Max. The boy, a few minutes worried, looked at his mother, expecting her to say something else. But no. The woman remained silent, immersed in her own thoughts, and in the boy's mind the memories of the day his family was irrevocably destroyed surfaced. Max had been picked up from daycare much earlier than usual that day. His mother wasn't in the best of spirits, and the boy didn't understand what was going on. But he didn't ask anything, didn't say anything, realizing perfectly well that this could be the cause of another breakdown on his mother's part. He followed her silently, barely keeping up with the speed of her steps. At some point he stumbled, falling painfully to his knees, and at that very second his mother turned around sharply, speaking in an irritated voice. "You're nothing but trouble from yourself. You don't see where you should put your feet." She did not help the boy to get up, but only looked reproachfully at the way her son through the pain rose from the concrete floor. Tears were running down the boy's cheeks, but he did not make the slightest sound, knowing perfectly well that this could cause not the most pleasant consequences. He stood up and held out his mother's hand to go further, but she sharply pushed him away. The woman muttered through gritted teeth, "You're as worthless as your father. You can't do anything right in this life. There's a reason I didn't want you. And if now it turns out that the neighbor told me the truth and your foolish father is cheating on me, together with him threw out of the house, you got me." The woman spoke with anger and hatred. She didn't even try to hide her displeasure, looking at the boy with that reproachfulness that made him uncomfortable. Max, stunned, looked at his mother, not understanding what she meant or why he and his father would have to leave home. A few seconds passed as Pam walked briskly toward the house, leaving her bewildered son alone. After a while, the boy came to his senses and rushed after his mother, not even realizing what was waiting for him at home in a few minutes. Max entered the house at the moment when screams were already heard from behind the door. The boy froze at the door, not realizing what was happening. He only listened to the screams. "What the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" Max's father was yelling. "What makes you think I can be home alone? Listen to your crazy girlfriends who want to destroy our family happiness." I could hear in his voice that the man was very angry. obviously not going to calm down so easily. He continued to be indignant as he heard Pam's disgruntled voice, who was clearly not going to leave the situation so easily. What family happiness? What are you talking about? You and I aren't even roommates. We're living as strangers to each other. You don't love me at all. You don't appreciate me. How many times can you get on my nerves? Afterwards, there was the sound of glass breaking. Max continued to stand still, hesitating to enter the house. The next second, the boy's father ran out of the house holding his belongings in his hands. He looked completely confused, and the next instant, Pam ran out of the house throwing things at her spouse. She was screaming, and at that moment her eyes were filled with hatred and pain. "Get out of my house. I don't trust you. You're cheating on me. And in front of my own child. Take him with you, and get out." Max looked fearfully at his mother. He didn't want to leave home, and he couldn't imagine that she had meant it when she threatened to kick him out of the house. Until the last moment, he was sure his mother was just joking. "Do I need this kid? I'm not even sure he's mine. She's got him somewhere. And now I have to raise him and be responsible for him. I've got nothing to do. You're the one who got him. You're the one who's going to take care of him." The man looked at Max reproachfully, and then he muttered something under his nose and went in the opposite direction from the house. He never looked back, never said anything else, and generally never appeared in little Max's life again. Pam was taking the loss of her spouse extremely hard, even though she had initiated the situation. From that moment on, the woman began to seek solace in strong drinks, and partly really found it. But only for little Max, such changes in the usual way of life were extremely traumatic. There were constantly strangers in the house who spent evenings and often nights in Pam's company. They often treated the boy badly, who looked at them with frightened eyes and often cried when he heard strange noises coming from his parents' room. He asked his mother many times, when would Daddy come back? When would they make up? But time after time, Pam looked at her son with contempt and answered in a haughty voice, "You don't have a father anymore. He doesn't need you. And if you don't like it, you can go to your daddy, if you can find him, of course." The woman shouted unhappily, looking at her son with such disgruntled contempt that it made him uncomfortable. Max squeezed his head into his shoulders, trying to hide from his mother's reproachful gaze. It was impossible to do so, however. Pam looked at her son with displeasure, and her gaze was getting heavier by the minute. "Why are you looking at me like that, as if you were seeing me for the first time? Go to your room before I kick you out of my house too." The boy shuddered and immediately went to his room. He did not fully understand what was happening, but already at this moment in his soul began to arise hatred for his mother, which in the future will lead to bad consequences. Since that moment, several years have passed. Max became more independent, conscious. The boy was no longer afraid to say what he thought, and could easily fight back and stand up for himself. By the age of 12, he did not let anyone offend him, knowing how to put a man in his place not only by force, but also with words. During this period, communication with his mother almost ceased. He continued to live in her house because there was no choice. However, he tried not to cross paths with her at all. So the days stretched one after another, turning into a string of identical events. But that was only until Pam brought Carl home. He was a relatively young man who was courting the woman in every possible way. He complimented her, cooked breakfast in bed, and didn't miss an opportunity to spend every minute of his free time. The woman was incredibly pleased with the appearance of such a man next to her. Max, on the other hand, was not at all delighted. Something about the young man seemed strange and suspicious to him. He acted too much like a playboy in those situations where Pam was, and he acted very differently when she wasn't around. Several months had passed since the arrival of the new member of the family, and one evening when Pam was already having her 10th dream, Max overheard Carl talking. "Just hang on a little longer. We need that money. Soon this broad will agree to sign over her house to me so I can feel like a man." After these words, there was a short silence. Max immediately realized that the man was talking to someone on the phone. But to whom? Suddenly, Carl's voice came again, and he irritatedly said, "Stop making my brain every few days. How many times can you do this? I told you it's going to be fine. I'm in control of the situation, and I myself know exactly what to do." Silence again. Max listened with all his might, trying to understand what was being said on the other end. However, it was impossible to hear anything. It became clear that the phone was not on speakerphone. This kid won't do anything. He's nobody here. She'll listen to what I say, or else I'll just leave her alone. And then she'll come crawling back to me on her knees, begging me to come back. So don't worry. I'm sure everything will work out for the best. Besides, she's already willing to do anything for me. And all that's left is to push her a little so that she doesn't even think before she does anything. Max couldn't believe what he was hearing. He suspected something was wrong with Carl, of course. But he couldn't even imagine that the situation would play out like this. For several minutes he stood in confusion, and only at the moment when he heard Carl say goodbye to the caller did he rush to his room. His mind was filled with the most unpleasant thoughts, which he could not get rid of. He thought of telling his mother everything. But when? Now? Should he wake her up? And would she even believe his story? Love often blinds you to the real problems, making you look through rose-colored glasses and think everything will be all right. But could Pam have imagined how things would end up? Waiting until morning was excruciatingly difficult. Max managed to change his mind overnight dozens of not the most pleasant thoughts, and to conclude that the mother must be urgently rescued from such a relationship. But how to do it? After numerous considerations and internal disputes, the guy realized that the best option would be to simply tell everything as it is. But such a reaction from his mother he cannot even imagine. "How dare you try to ruin my family happiness again?" shouted Pam at her own son, not believing everything he said. Max tried to convey all the details of the conversation, Carl's mood and voices. But the more small moments in the story, the more irritated Pam became. The woman looked at her son with displeasure, obviously unwilling to admit that everything he said could be true. "It was you who broke up my first marriage, and I won't let you ruin my happiness again. Keep all your games and your weird thoughts to yourself, or I'll make sure you never live in this house again. Don't forget that you live with me, not I with you, and you have no right to tell me what to do." There was so much venom and resentment in every word that Max felt uncomfortable. He looked at his mother with anxiety and incomprehension. He tried with all his might to hold back his emotions. But despite his inner torment and the cry of his mind that he should keep silent, he still asked, "Why do you think I was to blame for the breakup of your family? It was you who couldn't keep it together. You made up your own mind, and then you kicked him out of the door without even listening to him. You realized that you were wrong in that situation, and it was because of you that everything turned out the way it did." Max spoke calmly and confidently. He wasn't going to make excuses or apologize. After all, in his 12 years he already understood perfectly well what really happened at that moment. The boy looked at his mother carefully, realizing that he had thrown her into complete confusion with his answer. A few minutes passed when he added, "And you don't have to try to blame me for all your problems. You're an adult and you should realize that all the consequences are your fault. You were the adult. You were the one who had to make decisions that will affect not only your life, but mine as well. So I would ask you not to blame me for something I had nothing to do with." Max noticed that with each new phrase the mother's look was getting heavier, and so he decided to keep silent, so as not to inflame the situation. But all said was already enough to make the woman furious. "How dare you talk to me like that?" shouted Pam at her son. "Have you forgotten where you belong? Have you lost your fear, or have you decided you don't need a roof over your head anymore? I'll remind you where you are and whose money you live on." The woman came right up to the boy, looking into his eyes with hatred. Max did not look away as he always did. He continued to look at his mother, realizing that he was tired of living the way she wanted him to, and doing everything just to please her and be a good son. The boy's gaze was frustrated and blank. He didn't know what else to say or do to make his mother believe his words and not ruin his and his future by his own naivety and stupidity. "It was after you were born that your father and I had a bad relationship. We didn't want you, but it was too late to do anything when I realized what was wrong. And your dad wanted a baby, and I was stupid enough to have you. I thought it would make our relationship even stronger, but it was the opposite. I didn't want to see your father after I got out of the hospital. He didn't spend time with you. He was always at work, and he had no idea how hard it was for me. He didn't help, and he didn't bring in enough money to keep us from living in poverty. It's lucky I got this house from my parents. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten through that period. He was always complaining that I was irritable and tired. How could I be different with you? You constantly yelled, did not let me sleep, did not let me eat in peace, constantly demanded attention, cried. If I didn't give it to you, you were always doing things at home, doing bad things, as if to spite me. I hated you with all my heart and soul, but I believed that soon it would get easier. And then the neighbor called and told me that your daddy was cheating on me. You see, he was tired and told her he just wanted to have a good time, that I was no longer as affectionate and attractive to him after you were born. It's all because of you, you know. And now you're going to tell me how to live my life and what to do. It's because of you that my life has been irrevocably ruined. You're the reason I'm where I am today, and you will not dare to destroy such a fragile happiness that I finally have. The woman switched to screaming, clutching her son's shoulder hard, as if he was trying to escape from her. But Max continued to look at her calmly and seriously, waiting for the series of accusations and discontent to end. For a few more minutes, Pam expressed everything she thought. She wasn't shy with her expressions, and she wasn't afraid to egg her own child on. And Max? He was so used to her rudeness and coldness that he didn't pay any attention to the next attacks and threats. Finally, the woman was silent, closing her eyes and as if trying to control her emotions. All this time, the guy listened to her attentively, and then answered, You know, I didn't ask you to give birth to me. I'm sorry that I made your life so unbearable. But there was nothing I could do about it. Don't worry. In a few years, I'll stop bothering you with my presence. But then you'll realize I was right about your new boyfriend. But it will be too late. After saying that, Max turned around and went to his room. He didn't see any point in continuing the dialogue. He didn't want to listen to the accusations of his mother's displeasure. Pam did not listen to her son. It seemed to her that he was deliberately making all this up to get attention and make himself the only man in the house. But she couldn't imagine how it would end. It had been several days since Max had last talked to his mother. He no longer saw any point in proving anything to her or trying to open her eyes to reality. Carl was getting closer and closer to the woman, showing attention and making her trust him as much as possible. The guy saw all this, but decided to do nothing, letting the situation take its course. But he did not realize that his mother's mistake would affect his life too. One evening, when Pam was in a high mood, Carl decided to start the realization of his plan. The man looked at the woman carefully, trying to convey as much emotion as possible with his gaze. At that moment, Pam smiled smugly, saying, "Why are you looking at me like that?" I liked it. She moved closer to the guy, looking at him intently. It was only a few seconds before Carl moved closer and in a smug voice said, looking the woman straight in the eye, "How can a man not like you? I'm actually surprised how you didn't get picked up by anyone else. And why did you choose me out of a huge number of options? Although, admittedly, I would have chosen me if I were you. I'm incredibly hot. That's why you love me, baby." Carl moved even closer, leaving almost no distance between them. He looked into the woman's eyes, then spoke in a satisfied voice. "I'm sure I'm also incredibly charming, aren't I?" He stopped a few centimeters away from the woman's face. Suddenly he moved closer to her ear, burning her skin with his hot breath, and spoke in a scalding whisper. "I would so like to marry you. I wish I could. You are so gorgeous, so desirable to me." He whispered compliments in the woman's ear, making her smile as wide and sincere as she had ever seemed. Carl had nudged the woman several times that he wanted to make her his in every sense. He wants to build a family with her. He wants to be her official spouse. He wants to be with her always, no matter what. So what's stopping you? If you want to marry me, you can do it. I'm ready to be your wife right now. I'm ready to go to the registry office with you. She moved closer to the guy, looking intently into his eyes. In his gaze there was so much determination and confidence in his words that for a second Carl was even embarrassed. But he immediately pulled himself together and said in a confident voice, "You know, I just can't feel like a full-fledged man while I'm not on my own territory. But you know, it's the classic male thing." He smiled, trying to make his words more casual. But Pam tensed. Her mind flashed back to the last conversation she'd had with her son, when he'd tried to say something about Carl's plans for her place. She pulled away from the man a little, and he sensed something amiss. His demeanor became sharper and his words more confident. "But that doesn't mean you have to do anything." Carl tried to diffuse the situation. "I'm not forcing you to do anything. It's just your head, and you don't have to live up to it. I'll love you without a stamp in my passport. It just makes our relationship more informal." He moved closer, trying to make the tension less, to make a more intimate setting. After a few minutes of attentive gazing into Pam's eyes, Carl added in a languid voice, "I just so wanted to make you my wife." His lips gently touched the woman's skin, and she felt a pleasant tingling sensation at the spot. A current seemed to run through her skin that left a sensation that was simply inexpressible. Pam exhaled noisily, trying to make it as quiet as possible, but whether it was from her relaxed state after a few drinks, or because she liked the man so much she couldn't resist. Wrapping her whole body around him, she looked at Carl and spoke in a languid voice. "And what do you need to make me yours? What do you want from me?" The woman moved closer to stare intently into the eyes of her new suitor. She had expected any answer other than what she had heard from Carl. "I just want to feel like the boss in this house. How can I feel like one if this house doesn't belong to me?" He moved closer, burning Pam's skin with his breath and thus forcing her to close her eyes. A few seconds passed before he added, "You and I would be so good together if we lived in this apartment as husband and wife. Don't you think so? I'd bring you gifts every day, and you and I would have had a girl, just like you wanted." Carl deliberately pressed the topics that mattered most to Pam. She had always wanted a daughter. The birth of a son had been an unpleasant surprise. She whispered with her eyes closed, "Carl, but we can be happy without a stamp in our passport, can't we? I'm sure we'll have a beautiful daughter anyway, and that will do just fine as parents." The woman spoke with her eyes closed, trying to concentrate on her emotions. Suddenly she felt the man's scalding breath disappear. She opened her eyes, looking intently at Carl, who sat a meter away from her with a perplexed expression. He clearly hadn't expected such a response from the woman, and so he was frantically thinking about what he should say to that. But Pam was not confused, continuing in a confident voice to say, "Why are you so surprised by my words? Can't people be happy without a stamp in their passports? As for me, the state does not need to interfere in our relationship. Besides, I've already had a bad experience of marriage, and I don't intend to repeat it." Pam moved closer to Carl, but he pulled away. The ingenious, elaborate plan in his head began to fall apart. He stared bewildered at the woman who was clearly speaking completely, seriously. The silence was dragging on and becoming awkward. Pam's gaze, on the other hand, was acquiring notes of tension. And at that moment Carl realized that he had to think of something urgently. Suddenly he said, "I'm just a little confused about what you're thinking. If you want a family, why don't we formalize our relationship? I thought we were serious, and you wanted to spend the rest of your life with me." I could hear the disappointment in the man's voice. He stared at Pam in confusion, trying to figure out what to do in such a situation. There were all kinds of thoughts in his head, and it seemed that there was no right answer among them. Carl raised his eyes to the woman, and then in an uncertain voice he said, "What's the point of our relationship if you don't consider continuing it? Why have we spent so much time building a bond of trust and such intimacy?" Carl spoke seriously. It seemed that the man was really upset, and whether from the hot drinks or the strange pinching feeling inside, it seemed to Pam that he was telling the truth, that he really didn't understand what was going on. And for a moment, the woman even felt a pang of guilt that she hadn't trusted her young man from the beginning, for doubting his words because her son was trying to prove otherwise. She looked at Carl carefully, trying to understand his feelings. And after a couple minutes she said, "Well, is it really that important to you? You never told me you wanted to start a family. This is the first time we've had this conversation. Why are you overreacting?" The woman moved closer and looked into the man's eyes. She didn't understand why this topic was so acute and sudden in their relationship. "It's very important, you know. Very important. You see, I was brought up in such a way that I should build a family if I really love my beloved. And I love you, and I'd like to legitimize our relationship soon. But..." Carl was silent, as if thinking about what to say next, and then added, "But I was also taught that in the house the master should be a man. He should solve all the problems and provide for his woman. I don't have a problem with the latter, but with the former. I can't feel myself, a man, when in fact in that house nobody and I have no rights. How do you envision it? He looked at the woman carefully, trying to make his look as sad and confident as possible. Once again there was silence, but this time it lasted only a few seconds. Pam replied, "But I don't quite understand. But if it's so important to you, then fine. I'll put you in my house. It'll just take a little time." But the woman smiled, looking intently at her chosen one. "You can propose to me now, can't you? We'll start planning the wedding and then I'll move you in. And we'll already legalize our relationship, just like you wanted." Pam moved closer, noticing the slight flicker in the man's eyes, but he tried not to show his concern. Smiling, the man nodded. Pam immediately relaxed, for she realized her son's words were not true. No one had tried to take the house away from her. No one had claimed her property. And what bad could happen from the fact that she would register someone at her place? It doesn't give Carl any rights or opportunities. But had she known how the story would actually end, and how it would unfold over the next couple months? Max never spoke to his mother after their scandal. He couldn't forgive her distrust and constant judgment, and so he took the path of least resistance and completely cut off all communication. He tried not to cross paths with her at all, even in his own home. He left earlier, came back later. Oh, the presence of Carl in the house he completely ignored, pretending that the man was not there. The boy was extremely puzzled the moment he learned of his mother's plans. He happened to overhear her conversation with her friend, which made him numb with shock. Would his mother really agree to marry Carl? Does she no longer even believe that her former spouse can return and their family will be complete again? Does she not see his brilliant game and does not realize that everything will not end in the best way? Despite all the excitement, indignation, and resentment, Max did not talk to his mother about anything. He knew perfectly well that it would once again be reduced to accusations and loud words. And he didn't want that. Let it be as it was. So it went on for almost 2 years. There was no proposal, and the guy began to think that it was all just words to the wind, that Carl just tried to pull a scam at the moment when he realized that it wouldn't work, decided to do nothing to keep the roof over his head. But it wasn't that simple. All these years Carl just thought up a new plan, still not daring to realize it. At some point he even left Pam for a few weeks alone, but then returned for reasons unknown to Max. The guy's life gradually began to get better. He started to work part-time, and then he had his first money of his own. Despite the unbearable desire to spend it, he started saving to move to the city in the future. To combine work and study was not easy, and therefore Max began to skip school more often, giving preference to earnings. Teachers could not ignore this. One day the guy was called to the director, and at this point he realized that so simply turn away will not work. With a heavy heart, he entered the office. "Max, is everything okay with your family? Lately it's gotten a lot worse studying, though that's completely unlike you. You've always been a confident and determined guy. What's wrong with you now?" the principal asked, looking at the boy carefully. She pointed to a vacant chair and Max sat down in it. Taking a deep breath, he decided to say everything that was going on in his soul. He had wanted to talk for so long and had wanted to share all his problems with someone for so long. And since fate had turned so that he had such an opportunity, he should not miss it. The monologue was long. The guy didn't miss a single moment that somehow appeared to him. He talked about Carl's conversation on the phone and all the doubts that had plagued him for the past 2 years, shared his thoughts on the whole thing. After there were no more words left in Max's head, he fell silent, looking intently at the principal. The woman clearly did not expect to hear so many revelations, and therefore sat in confusion. After a few dozen seconds of silence, she spoke. "I can help you solve the problem. Do you want me to talk to your mother about what's going on? I'm sure she'll listen to me. Or maybe you need some financial help. You do realize that skipping school to work is not the best solution. You have to get at least a high school education. Otherwise, you could be in a lot more serious trouble than talking to me." She looked at Max, who didn't seem at all surprised by her words. The guy looked at the woman carefully, and then calmly spoke. "Yes. I understand what the consequences may be, but if I do not work, I will not be able to put aside money. And, as a consequence, I won't be able to leave my parents' house so easily in the future. I didn't plan to stay there past adulthood. He fell silent, looking at the principal intently. He had a brilliant idea in his head, which he decided to realize immediately. With a more serious look, he asked, "Do you really want to help me? Or are you just telling me this because you want to seem like a good person in my eyes?" "I really want to help you, Max. I understand perfectly well that you are in a difficult position, and I can talk to your mother about the situation." "No, you don't need to talk to her. I don't need that kind of help." "Thank you." Max spoke sharply, interrupting the woman. "If you really want to help me, make sure I don't get expelled from school. I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure you can influence my grades. I'm not asking for B's or A's. I just need to get my high school diploma. It's only 2 years away. I am already in the 10th grade." So he looked at the principal carefully, trying to understand her emotions. The first few seconds, the woman's gaze was heavy and completely incomprehensible. Max was already beginning to doubt that she would help, as suddenly the woman sighed heavily, and without hesitation in her voice she spoke. "All right, I'll help you, but only on the condition that you'll devote at least some time to your studies. You can't not come at all, and you can't not study or do anything. The syllabus has to be fulfilled anyway, whether you like it or not. Only then will I be able to arrange with the teachers to treat you a little more loyally." She looked intently at the boy, who literally glowed at her words. He jumped up from his seat and began to thank the woman fervently. The principal smiled back, realizing how much she had made life easier for the guy who was already in a bad situation. "Max, just please don't do anything stupid. If you have any problems, just come to me. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. You're not old enough, so I don't think you should take on such a big responsibility." "Okay." The boy nodded and thanked the woman once again, and left the office. From that moment on, the boy's life changed. He was treated much better at school, not being picked on for little things. Of course, he also fulfilled his part of the obligations and studied all the material as much as possible, and then came to the exams. It seemed that life began to get better. Everything became calm, measured, as suddenly life threw up new tests even worse than all the previous ones. One evening, returning home, Max found a very unusual picture. In the living room was a huge number of guests who congratulated his mother on something. After a few seconds of standing in complete confusion, he decided to approach a familiar woman and ask what was going on. But the answer simply shocked him beyond belief. "So your mother got proposed to. In a few weeks they will be married and become a full-fledged family." The woman was smiling, clearly delighted by this event. "To be honest, I didn't believe this kid would make a move. But he surprised me. I'm glad your mother was able to find someone." She continued to say something excitedly, but Max couldn't hear her. He was looking at his mother, who really seemed happy. Really? That's how it would be. Would Carl really be his new father? Would their family really be one more person now? Would the wedding really happen? Or was this just another trick to gain his mother's trust? There were so many questions in his head, but there were almost no answers. The situation seemed unreal. In 2.5 years, there had been no change in the relationship. Carl hadn't even moved into their house, despite Pam's numerous offers. And now? Now he'd decided to propose to her and build a full-fledged family. Something about it all seemed illogical and wrong. But Max couldn't figure out what it was. A few days had passed since the proposal. Now Carl fully lived in their house, and therefore Max began to cross paths with him often. The man began to actively support Pam in her not the healthiest hobby of trying hot drinks, and therefore the guy saw him more and more often in not the best condition. And one evening, going into the kitchen, he ran into Carl again. The man was in a completely inebriated state. He looked up at the guy, and he was so vague and somber that Max felt uncomfortable. He stared at the new family member for a few seconds, then mumbled, "You're doing fine. You look like you suck. It's like you've been unloading railroad cars all day instead of living life to your heart's content." After the proposal, Carl quit his previous job, explaining that he wanted to spend more time with his fiancée. From that moment on, he didn't work. What could not be said about the guy who had just returned after another shift in the fields? He looked at Carl with displeasure, but he didn't seem to notice his presence at all. Perhaps it was even better that way, because Max wasn't ready to talk to him as an equal. The guy walked in complete silence to the refrigerator to get something for dinner, when suddenly he heard Carl's not loud voice. "You have no idea, kid, what's really going on in my life and in my head. You were born into a well-to-do family and you've never been denied anything. Instead, I've had to make my own way in life. Yeah, I don't do it in the most honest way. But this world isn't as easy as you might think. In order to achieve anything, you have to keep on keeping on, so that you don't get caught in all your shady dealings. At the same time, you always need to keep yourself in control, to remain charming and attractive to all these ladies. You can't even imagine how hard it is to control that." Carl sighed heavily, closing his eyes. Max stood silent, not understanding where such a harsh revelation in his words came from. But seeing a few bottles, he realized that he had actually untied the man's tongue. But should he continue this conversation? Should he even try to find out anything at all? After all, his mother would accuse him of lying again, even if he did tell her something. Should he even waste his time and energy on this? After thinking about the situation for a few seconds, Max said goodnight to Carl and left the kitchen. He saw no point in staying and listening to his mother's discontent and problems with the fiancé. And after all, if he had stayed that night, his life could have turned out in a completely different way. He would not blame himself in the future for not doing anything, for not listening to Carl at the moment of revelation, and for not even trying to do anything to stop him. But what's done is done. And in the future it remains only to be responsible for the decisions made and to pass through the trials with proudly raised head. The wedding of Carl and Pam still took place, despite the fact that Max was sure of the opposite. The newlyweds immediately after the ceremony went on their honeymoon. The guy stayed home alone. No one called him to go together. But even if he had been called, he would have definitely refused such an offer. He didn't want to spend time with his mother, and the opportunity to be alone seemed like a gift to him. Had he known that now he would never be able to communicate with his mother, never be able to have a heart-to-heart talk with her, never be able to ask for forgiveness, forgive her for everything that had happened before. He had no idea how everything would really end and what such a seemingly innocent vacation trip would lead to. Max was at home when he heard the sound of the door opening. He looked at the time and the number on his phone. It was too early for a return from a wedding trip. His mother had planned to be back in at least 2 weeks, and it had only been 9 days. Holding his breath, he got out of bed, not realizing who could have been brought to his house at this hour. Suddenly he remembered that he had left the front door unlocked, so anyone could have come in. It became uncomfortable at the thought that a complete stranger could come in. Or maybe it was a burglar who decided to take advantage of the departure of the owners, not knowing that someone else lives here? Or maybe some of Carl's associates decided to clean the place out while he's gone, so no one could think anything of him. The thoughts in my head were not pleasant, and at one point it even flashed into my head that I didn't want to go anywhere. But fear and interest made the boy leave his room. He slowly walked towards the entrance, not realizing who he was about to meet. Cautiously peeking out from around the corner, Max froze in bewilderment. Carl was standing on the threshold. He seemed confused and lost. For a few seconds the boy tried to understand what was wrong. Suddenly he realized that his mother was not with her newfound spouse. He had returned alone and was now looking around, trying to see if anyone was home. Max watched his behavior for a few seconds. Then he decided to come around the corner. Carl stirred when he saw the boy and looked at him sharply. An anxiety began to rise inside, which clearly did not bode well. Max looked at the man carefully, then asked him uncertainly, "Why did you come back alone? Weren't you supposed to come back with my mother together? You still have a few more days of paid vacation. Or has she already found someone better than herself at the resort?" Max smiled wryly. Even in such a situation, he couldn't refuse not to mock his mother's chosen one. But Carl did not react to these words. He continued to look around in confusion, only occasionally returning his gaze to the boy. Something in his behavior seemed strange and suspicious. After a few seconds, Max added in a worried voice, "What happened? Why did you come home alone? Where is your mother?" The guy stared at Carl for a few seconds and then pulled out his cell phone and dialed his mother's number. After a few beeps, the voice of the answering machine was heard. which notified that the subscriber was out of network coverage. For a few seconds, Max looked at the phone with incomprehension. Then he raised an animal gaze at Carl. The guy grabbed the man by his t-shirt, pulling him to himself with force, after which he spoke in an irritated voice. "What the hell is going on? Where's my mother and why did you come home before her? When is she coming back? If I find out you did anything to her, you can't live. I'm giving you a good warning. You hear me?" Max screamed, unable to contain his emotions. He wasn't going to hold back in a situation like this. The irritation and resentment only grew stronger. Carl, on the other hand, continued to remain silent, looking at the guy with a blank and detached stare. Max felt his patience coming to an end. He shook Carl sharply, forcing him to look at himself, and then through gritted teeth he said, "If you don't tell me what the hell is going on right now, I'm going to find out for myself, and then you're going to be in trouble." There was so much rage and venom in every word that Carl shuddered. He shifted his gaze to the boy, then shook his head slowly from side to side. He covered his eyes, as if trying to cope with his emotions, and said nothing. Only in Max's arms, as if completely devoid of strength. For the first few seconds the guy held him in utter bewilderment, and then he unclenched his hands and spoke irritably. "What does all this mean? What do you mean no? What are you talking about?" Carl involuntarily raised his knee as if trying to defend himself from Max's attacks. But the guy wasn't going to back down so easily. He squatted down. "If you don't tell me now where your mother is and what happened to her, you'll never speak again. You hear me?" There was a steely note in the guy's voice, and it made Carl really scared. He opened his eyes, trying to focus. Then, in a depressed, almost inaudible voice, he spoke only 3 words. "She's gone." Then he closed his eyes again, pulling his knees even higher and trying to calm the storm that was raging inside him. A tear trickled down the man's cheek, letting Max know he meant what he said. Confusion, pain, incomprehension all blended into one strange, inexpressible feeling that was simply impossible to ignore. Fear rose higher and higher, making his heart beat faster and his legs shake. Max sank to his knees, staring at the floor, and thought for a few minutes about what he had heard. It seemed like some kind of evil joke that couldn't be true. It was only a few days ago that he had talked to her, seen her smile. He had only seen freshly posted pictures on her social media the day before yesterday. "How can you do this? Are you messing with me?" the guy said irritatedly, rising sharply to his feet and hovering over Carl. "What have you done to my mother? Do you have any idea what I could do to you? Look at me when I'm talking to you." The guy abruptly turned Carl face up, pulling his hands away from his face. There was so much fear and terror in the man's eyes that it was simply impossible not to notice it. Max, however, cared little for the man's condition. "What did you do?" "I knew I couldn't leave her with you. I told her what an asshole you are, and she wouldn't listen to me. So now what? What did you do to her? How many times do I have to ask you that question?" Max's foot came down hard on Carl and he tried to shrink away from another blow, but the guy reacted immediately, forcing the man to stay in the same position. He pressed down harder with his foot. Carl mumbled in pain, abandoning all attempts to assume a more secure position. Max slowly lowered himself over him and, looking straight into the eyes of his mother's abuser, said irritably, "As soon as I find out what you've done, and I will, your life will be a living hell. I promise you that you will never be able to sleep well or enjoy the different moments of your life again. I will be in every day of your life. I will not leave you alone under any circumstances. You will regret what you have done for the rest of your life, and I will not give you the slightest opportunity to live in peace. Do you hear me?" Carl looked fearfully at Max, who seemed like a predator ready to tear his prey apart. The boy, on the other hand, stared at the man carefully for several minutes to figure out what to do with him. He thought of nothing better than to take all his pain and resentment out on the man. He began to strike one by one, paying no attention to the screams, sobs, or pleas for help. He saw no man before him who deserved pity. He saw only someone who had completely and irrevocably ruined his life. He saw someone he hated more than anything else in the world. Someone who shouldn't be here, but should be in his mother's place. Even though Max didn't know exactly what had happened, he was sure that Carl had everything to do with it. He wasn't going to wait for justice. He didn't want to wait until the trial had been held and the judge himself had ruled one way or the other. He couldn't control his emotions, and he didn't even want to try to calm down in any other way. He didn't know how much time had passed when the police arrived. Apparently, one of the concerned neighbors decided to call the officers of the law after hearing the screams and the obvious sounds of beatings. The uniformed men were rapidly approaching Max, who was hovering over Carl. The man didn't look his best. At one point, it even seemed to the guy that he wasn't moving. But he wasn't. Immediately after Max was pulled away from the man, Carl promptly jumped to his feet, moving away from the place where he had just been lying a few meters away. He looked frightened and confused. The man's gaze was blank and directed somewhere past Max, who was staring at him with disdain. The guy was not going to accept the situation so easily, so he began to break free and shout, trying to continue what he had started. "Let go now. Him. It's his fault that my mother is gone. I'm not going to just leave him like that, giving him a happy and carefree life. He must pay for what he's done." "Let go!" Max screamed and tried to break free from the police officer's tight grip, but it was impossible to do so. The law enforcement officers looked at each other, shifting their gaze to Carl. It seemed to them that the man was completely out of his mind, whether he was so depressed by grief or under the influence of some strange drugs. After a few seconds of thought, continuing to hold the rambunctious Max, who continued to make attempts to break free, one of the officers turned to his confused partner. "Here's the deal. I'm taking this one with me now." He pointed to Max, who became a little calmer in his arms, as if they were calming down little by little. "And you take the other one. Call for backup. We can't drive them in the same car. I'll see you back at the unit." Max felt his hands clenched tighter behind his back, and the next second they were cuffed. He turned at the policeman in bewilderment, but said nothing, realizing that after what he had seen, he was unlikely to be believed. He walked obediently to the car and turned one last time to Carl, who was looking in his direction. Then the door of the police car closed abruptly in front of his face. Max was in solitary confinement. They didn't dare put him in with anyone else. After all, they were worried that the problem might be the guy who just turned out to be inadequate. He had seen Carl being led past, and all requests to put them together had been refused. Perhaps it really was better this way. After all, Max was completely unsure of his own actions and strength. It seemed to him that he could easily do something terrible, and he would not regret it at all. So the guy sat all night behind bars. He did not sleep. He had the most unpleasant thoughts in his head. But somewhere deep in his soul was the hope that all this is just a stupid joke, which has nothing to do with reality. That Carl was really under something. He'd made up all the nonsense he'd told him when he got home. That his mother had just found another suitor, and the man couldn't handle it, and decided to ruin her son's life. Outside the window, dawn broke. Max rose powerlessly from his bunk, feeling his entire body break incredibly from fatigue. He still couldn't bring himself to sleep without knowing what had happened to his mother. Unable to bear the confinement of the unknown any longer, he began to scream, demanding to call a co-worker and tell him something. After a few minutes of shouting, at the moment when it began to seem that no one would come through, a stately man of age approached the cell. For a few seconds he looked at the prisoner in complete detachment, and then calmly said, "What kind of circus are you making here? You were told to wait until the trial was over, so you're going to sit and wait. No one's going to tell you anything just because you want to. We have no reliable information except that your mother's husband is under the influence of some strange drug. He'll come to his senses soon, and we'll question him. Until then, I'd ask that you behave according to the rules. Otherwise, we'll put you in solitary confinement, not at the station, but in prison, where you can scream all you want. I hope we understand each other." The man was about to leave when suddenly behind his back came the excited voice of a boy. "What about my mother? Did you find out what that asshole did to her? She hasn't been in touch?" "Yes, and he himself said that she was gone." Max involuntarily went to shout, but immediately stopped talking. Seeing the displeased look of the man, the employee came closer to him, sighing heavily, then spoke without a drop of irritation. "Son, I understand your emotions perfectly. I too lost my mother early. But at the moment the guilt of the detained man is not proven. We can't make a decision until the investigation is complete. It could take a long time. If we prove his guilt, he'll go to jail. And if not, The man spread his hands, signaling that he would be completely powerless in such a situation. There was a few seconds of tense silence when Max said through gritted teeth, "If it turns out that he's involved in this whole thing, I'll deal with him myself. He won't wait for real justice, I'll carry it out myself." The man heard the boy's words perfectly well, but did not answer him. He only sighed heavily and went back to his office, not wanting to continue such a difficult dialogue. It seemed to Max that time was dragging on endlessly. From time to time he listened to the strange sounds that came from the depths of the building, but he could not understand what was going on there. At some point his body just gave up, and the guy fell into a restless sleep. He kept turning around and could not make himself stop thinking about something bad. Several hours passed like that, as suddenly someone's hand touched him. Max woke up sharply, climbing up on the bunk, immediately ran into a glance with the very man who had come in the morning to his screams. He looked completely depressed, staring at the floor. He didn't raise his eyes to the boy, though he could see someone looking anxiously in his direction. After a few seconds of tense silence, Max was the first to speak. "Well, did you find out? You didn't just come to my cell to keep me company. Did he tell you where my mother is and why she hasn't been in touch?" "What happened?" Max watched the man sigh heavily as he closed his eyes, and then his heart skipped a beat. He realized that nothing good was going to be told to him, and so he needed to start preparing for the worst right now. "What happened? Stop talking. This is bullying. Tell me what happened." Max started screaming. He was at his limit, and he couldn't bring himself to stay calm even when talking to a policeman. "I'm sorry, boy," the man spoke, raising his gaze to Max. "Your mother is really gone." The detained man said that they were resting on some beach when they were approached by locals. They offered to have a great time and buy some strange cocktails. According to him, he immediately refused such an idea, but his wife insisted. He paid for them, after which they continued to admire the view. The cocktail seemed strange to him and he refused to drink it. "But your mother?" She said that she liked the taste very much, so she would finish it, since her husband was against it. She took the second cocktail, took a few sips, and then returned to her drink. At some point the detainee felt that something was wrong. The picture in front of his eyes became less clear. There was a strange feeling of approaching end. He immediately jumped to his feet, but a sharp weakness made him sink to the floor. For a few seconds everything floated before his eyes, and then he saw his spouse falling in front of him in an unnatural pose. She whispered something about not being able to breathe. And then darkness. The man was silent, as if he could not control his emotions. He sat with his eyes closed for a few seconds, waiting for the boy to say something. But Max remained silent. The detainee claims that he doesn't remember anything else. Only the voices that appeared after the moment when the whole world was plunged into darkness. They said something about not tolerating newcomers in their territories, and that it would be the same for anyone who came there. When the detainee woke up, he was already lying alone. No one was around, including his spouse. We do not know how true this is, but such cases have indeed been recorded before. We've never been able to find anyone missing. I'm sorry. The man turned to Max, who had hot tears running down his cheeks. He looked at the law enforcement officer in disbelief, not understanding how this could have happened. After a few seconds, when there were no other emotions left inside the guy but pain and hatred, he jumped up, rushing to the exit of the cell. The door was open, and therefore there was nothing to stop him from getting out of it. Max immediately rushed in the direction where Carl should have been sitting, completely ignoring the cries behind him. He just wanted revenge for his mother. He wanted to tell Carl what he thought of him, and he didn't care at all what the consequences would be. Max had no trouble finding Carl in the other solitary confinement cell. His look was completely lost. It seemed like the man had just lost his mind in the couple days he'd been in this place. "I warned you, if anything happened, you'd be in trouble. You think I was joking with you?" Max rushed toward the bars, but Carl behind them didn't even flinch at the sudden movement and loud sound. At that moment a coworker came up and started pulling the guy away and trying to calm him down. But Max was not going to leave things as they were. He struggled forward, trying to free himself from the tight grip, realizing that he would not have another chance. "Let me go." It was his fault she was gone. Why the hell would he continue to live quietly after what he'd done? Max tried to break free, but at that moment 2 more employees ran into the room. They easily stopped the guy, forcing him to sit on a chair that stood a couple of meters away from the bars. The employee who had been sitting with Max before squatted down beside him, looking into the guy's eyes. "Kid, listen to me carefully. It's not the best option to try to get revenge on your own. You've got to realize that's not an option. You'll only jeopardize your future. We're going to figure this out, and you're going to have to stay out of it." "I will." The man stared intently at the boy. Without giving him a chance to shift his gaze to Carl behind bars, "You've got to think about what you've got to live and live on. And if you ruin your reputation now, it will be extremely difficult to restore it. Plus, you'll have a criminal record on your record forever, and no normal place will hire you for school or work. I promise you I'll look into this personally, but you have to promise me you'll stay out of this mess." "Okay." The man continued to stare at Max until he nodded confidently. At that point he let him go and rose to his feet and took a step back, turning to the prisoner who was now the defendant. He muttered, "Watch this carefully. Don't let him do anything to himself until we know what's going on, and I'll be asking you personally. If anything happens to him, and to him." The man turned again to Max, who was staring emotionally at the floor, sitting on a chair. He sighed heavily and mouthed, "Something has to be worked out with him too. You can't just leave him in your ward. Besides, he's a minor. There might be some unpleasant consequences for our department for detaining him. We should let him go." The man nodded to his own thoughts and was about to leave when he heard the confused voice of another employee. "But if he's a minor, we can't just let him go. He has no one at home, and we have to hand him over to the guardianship authorities." The voice seemed confused. All eyes were suddenly on Max, who didn't care at all about what would happen to him next. He didn't see any point in continuing all these pointless negotiations at all. They were unpleasant to him. "So, call over there. But the kid's not supposed to be here tonight. Let me know how it turns out. Where in the future I should look for him. Fulfill him." After these words, the man left the office, leaving Max for the other law enforcement officers. They called the guardianship and custody authorities. After a short trial, it was decided to temporarily take the guy to the places of residence of minors, without parents and guardians. Max did not resist, just did what he was told. It seemed that there was nothing else left in the world that could please him, or become for him a new meaning of life. But he couldn't even imagine how his life would turn out in the future and how different a person he would become in just a few years. Max was left at the shelter until the circumstances were clarified. He spent a few days there. Nothing was said or explained to him. Those few days seemed like hell to the boy. He didn't want to sleep, eat, or do anything. His only wish was to wake up from this nightmare that had come into his life. One day the manager of the institution said that in a few days Max would be redirected to an orphanage, as there was no one with legal capacity to take him without guardianship. They tried to ask Max about his father or other relatives, but he was not eager to talk and expressed this reluctance vividly. He was well aware of what would happen to him next. He had acquaintances who had grown up in orphanages, and according to them, the conditions there were not that they were not the best, but rather terrible. To survive this period and not get a huge amount of moral and physical traumas is simply impossible. Therefore, the guy began to adjust himself to the fact that he would have to fight back hard, and from the first day. There were only a few hours left before the departure, when in the corridor there was an agitated, familiar voice. "How dare you keep me away from him? I've done all the paperwork I need to do. I don't care if you're getting ready to leave. I have a right to take him out of here. I know exactly what the law allows me to do and what it doesn't. You have no right to stop me. Get out of the aisle." Max turned around, completely unaware of what was happening in the hallway. And at that moment, the principal of the school he was attending burst into his room. She looked around, confused and to some extent even frightened. But the moment her gaze reached Max, she relaxed, smiled. She sat down on the edge of the bed and spoke in a worried voice. "I promised you that I would help you in every way I could, that I wouldn't leave you in the lurch, no matter what happened to you. As a matter of fact, here I am, and I just found out about the tragedy a couple days ago. I'm so sorry." The woman was silent for a few seconds, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she added, I'm sorry I didn't talk to you about this beforehand, but I've decided to apply for custody of you. Of course, I believe that your mother will be found safe and sound. Maybe she'll come home soon. And the custody is temporary, and once things get better, I'll give it up. I did it so they wouldn't take you to an orphanage. I don't think that's where you want to be." The woman stared at the boy in bewilderment, not understanding the emotion his face was expressing. There was confusion, pain, and relief mixed with tenderness and gratitude in his gaze. A few seconds passed as the woman added, "Of course, you can refuse my custody if you don't want to live with me. I'm not forcing you to. But just you don't think you can choose how you want to live your life and what you want to do." The woman looked at the guy with undisguised worry. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke in an uncertain voice, looking into the woman's eyes. "Thank you so much. I never imagined that you would be there for me in such a situation. Thank you." Max pressed himself sharply against the woman, trying to convey all the feelings and awe that were in his soul. He couldn't even imagine that life would turn this way after so many problems. After a tremendous amount of trials, some relief finally came. The guy felt his whole body begin to beat a small shiver. After so many problems, after constant tension, after sleepless nights, after worrying and worrying about the future, he could finally relax. Finally, there was something good in his life, which he was extremely grateful for. Claire was the name of the principal, who decided to take Max to herself. For a few weeks she was still getting used to a grown-up boy at home. Sometimes she forgot that she had taken custody and that she didn't live alone. But Max was understanding. She didn't have to take him in. She only did it out of the kindness of her heart. After a couple of months, life fell into place. Max went back to work and continued to go to school. Many people knew what had happened, but no one dared to talk to him about it. The wounds on his heart were too fresh to touch. There was too much pain in the guy's eyes, which literally screamed that he should be left alone. The guy had successfully graduated from high school, passed all the exams to get his diploma. There was never any information about his mother. The investigator stayed in touch throughout this long period of time, but never said anything encouraging. Max no longer believed that his mother would return, so he tried his best to move on with his life. He planned to go to another city, find a job, try to start life with a clean slate. But Claire, who for a long time supported the guy and stayed by his side in the darkest times, wanted a different future for him. One night she decided to talk about the boyfriend's future and how she was willing to be a part of it. "That's out of the question. I don't want to keep spending your money. I'm old enough to start working on my own," resented Max after listening to his guardian's suggestions. Claire remained completely calm. She hadn't doubted that he wouldn't agree to her offer right away, and so she wasn't surprised by this reaction. But she didn't plan to back down so easily either. After waiting for the guy to stop expressing outrageous displeasure, she spoke in a calm and confident voice, looking at him. "You know, I've always dreamed of having a child. For years I had envisioned how he would grow up, how he would become a wonderful doctor in the future who would help those in need. I was always sure that someday I would become a mom, and my dream would be realized. But..." The woman closed her eyes and sighed heavily. Maxa did not hurry her, realizing that the topic was not the easiest for her. He looked at the woman in silence, waiting for her to continue speaking. "But after my beloved Nicholas was gone, I just couldn't imagine being the mother of anyone else, you see. I loved him so much that I could never feel anything like that for anyone else. I was sure the pain would go away eventually, and it did." But in its place, nothing new had taken its place. The emptiness kept me from feeling like a full woman for years. It made me doubt the rightness of every decision I made. It seemed to me that I simply could not be a complete person without my beloved by my side. And that was just the way it was. She looked up at Max and smiled sincerely. This smile was so simple and sincere that the guy just couldn't take his eyes off her. "And then you appeared, and my life became completely different. In some moments it even seemed to me that you really were my son, the one I wanted so badly all these years. You're exactly how I imagined my own child to be, and that's why I can't afford to ruin my own future. God didn't give me children, but fate brought me together with you. And I'm sure everything in this world happens for a reason. It's either an experience or a reward for getting it. I think it became a long-awaited gift that gave me life after so many problems and trials. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. She closed her eyes, trying to hold them back, but a lone tear was already rolling down her cheek. Let me realize my desires at least through you. I'm afraid that I will never again have the opportunity to be happy for someone who became practically a son to me the moment I received my diploma. It is my only wish. Please. The woman whispered the last words, and it sent shivers running down Max's back. He looked at her carefully, trying to overpower his feelings and still refuse, but he couldn't do it. After a few seconds, he responded in a quiet, almost inaudible voice, and looked at Claire with gratitude. This is a small part of what I can do to thank you for your kindness and your concern. He smiled. The woman opened her eyes, unable to believe her happiness. It seemed to her that even after such a frank confession, Max would still not agree to her proposal, that he would insist on independence and autonomy to the last. But no. She looked at him with trepidation, and there were far more words of gratitude in her gaze than she could possibly say. Max had been thinking for a long time about where he should apply. The exams were passed quite well, and therefore he had a lot of options where to try himself. But after studying the options and the proposals, he decided to stop at the medical university. It seemed to him that since he had agreed to realize Claire's dream, he should do it to the fullest. The admission went perfectly. Max was taken to the free department, where he had to study for 5 years. Throughout this time, Claire promised to help the guy, and that's exactly what she did. She sent money, helped with non-core disciplines, and supported the guy in all his endeavors. All this combined allowed Max to perfectly finish his studies and start his medical practice. To the surprise of many acquaintances, after a year of reflection, he chose the direction of gynecology. For some reason, it seemed to him one of the simplest and most profitable in terms of salary in the future. Without thinking for a long time, he decided to study to be a gynecologist, and in the future did not regret this decision a bit. By the time Max graduated from the university, Claire was 60. For the first few months, he thought about leaving for another city and starting to build a life with a clean slate. He'd done everything in his power to thank the woman for her kindness. Well, now it was time to leave the old life in the past and try to become a really happy person. The boy was sure it would be easy to leave. After all, he'd wanted to for so long. But life ordered in a completely different way, making it clear that his place is in this town and that he must stay here. And in the future it will play an important role in the life of Max, who will still be able to become really happy. On the day of farewell, when the guy had already packed all his things and was preparing to leave for another city, something completely unforeseen happened. He calmly folded the last t-shirts in his bag as Claire came into the room. She stared at the guy in complete silence for a few minutes, hesitating to say anything. Max glanced at her a few times but didn't dare to start a dialogue either. Finally, when Claire was ready to leave, he asked her if there was anything you wanted. You didn't just come to stand at the door, did you? Max paused, looking at the woman carefully. The woman turned around and smiled, answering, I just wanted to tell you that I'm very proud of you, and that I'm going to be lonely without you in this house. I'm so used to having you in my life. It's just going to be hard to get used to you being an adult and on your own. The woman's smile grew sadder at that moment. She closed her eyes, trying to calm down and keep talking. You know, you could stay in our town to be near us? Sure, you'd rent your own house or apartment, and in the future you'd definitely buy something. That way we'd still be around, but you'd be independent enough. She looked at the guy with hope, but in his eyes there was only regret and sadness. It became clear that Max was not burning with the desire to continue living in this city. With a few sad nods, the woman added, I'm sorry, but don't think I'm not pressuring you. I just wanted to offer you an option. I'm sure you'll be a great professional. The woman closed her eyes abruptly. Breathing noisily, she slowly sank to the floor, clenching her eyelids tighter and trying to stop the strange, tugging pain. Max immediately ran over to her, not realizing what he should do. After checking her pulse, he immediately dialed the ambulance. The wait was excruciating. I'm fine. Don't worry, it's just age. It's just a few minutes and I'll feel much better. You'll see. Everything will be fine, muttered the woman, trying to calm Max. But the guy knew perfectly well that there was nothing good in such a sharp pain and change of condition. And he was thinking about the worst. And that's exactly what happened. The ambulance took the woman to the hospital for examination and diagnosis. Max went along with them to stay informed of everything that was going on. Half an hour later, a doctor Max knew from his days of practice came out of the room. He rubbed his eyes tiredly, then looked up at the guy and spoke in a tired voice. "Heart trouble. She'll need an eye on her now. She asked me not to tell you what happened, so you could go to another city with peace of mind, but I can't do that. You know the problems people like that face. If you don't pay enough attention to them, the consequences may not be good." The man patted the boy on the shoulder, adding, "Of course, to make a decision about you, knowing full well that she is not your birth mother, but she did a lot to make you become the person you are now." After these words, the doctor left, leaving Max in complete bewilderment. He looked at him silently for a few seconds, then sighed heavily and went into the room. Claire was conscious. She was looking out the window, admiring the beautiful sunny day. Something in the back of her mind had bitten more at the moment when Max had seen her in that state. She immediately turned around at the sound of footsteps and smiled. "Why didn't you go home?" "I told you I'm fine. I'm just a little sick, but I'm fine now. You can go home in a few days." She smiled so sincerely that if Max didn't know the truth, he would have believed her words. "You can pack your things further. Just please say goodbye to me before you leave for another city. And don't forget to call me the moment you get there so I know you're okay." She spoke calmly and judiciously, that for a moment Max even thought that in fact everything was fine and the doctor had simply made a mistake. But the pallor and general soreness of her face said otherwise. He sighed heavily, sitting down next to Claire, and said in a calm voice, "I'll wait until you're discharged and then I'll think about moving. They'll wait for me at the new hospital, I'm sure of it." He smiled, trying to make the situation less tense. "Besides, how can I miss your birthday, which is next week? That would be completely unfair of me, wouldn't it?" He took the woman's hand in his own. They talked for a few hours, after which the guy went home. He had a difficult decision to make, and his future would depend on it. A few days later, Claire was indeed discharged home. The woman stood on the street and called a cab at the moment when Max came up to her with a bouquet of flowers. Surprised to see him, the woman said in a confused voice, "Weren't you going to interview for a job in another city? You might not be invited back in the future because they think you're not responsible enough." The woman looked at Max with concern and incomprehension. He was completely calm and confident. "I've already passed the interview. By the way, I've already been hired quite successfully. Tomorrow I start practicing as a gynecologist." He smiled, noticing that the woman was immediately amused by his words. She hugged the guy tightly, trying to convey with such a simple gesture all her warmth and affection. "I'll miss you, but I'm sure that in the new city your life will turn out the best. You'll make new friends, maybe even meet someone. I'll be glad if you can start your life with a clean slate like you wanted." At the last words, the woman's voice trembled. She pressed herself harder against the guy, trying not to show her real mood, and began to breathe heavily, trying to cope with her real feelings. Of course, Max noticed such changes in her condition. He pulled the woman tighter against him, after which he spoke. "You won't miss me." And at the moment when she was about to be indignant and say something against this conviction, Max hastily added, "From tomorrow I start practicing in this hospital, and I'll stay with you for a while if you don't mind. And then I'll think about how to organize my life. I don't want to make such serious, responsible decisions yet." Claire stared at the guy for a few seconds in disbelief. She didn't believe that he had really decided to stay, and that she wouldn't have to live her life alone. Max was glad that he was able to make happy the woman who was his only beacon in the most difficult period of his life. Yes, he didn't plan to stay in this city. Yes, he tried with all his might to leave it and do his best to start his life with a clean slate. But sometimes you have to think about more than just yourself. And this time he made a decision not in his favor. Many people knew Max since university. He showed excellent results and pleasantly communicated with patients. That is why at the moment when the appointment was announced, there was a queue to him at once. A few months passed from the beginning of the practice. At some point the guy began to notice that time after time a young girl, who had just turned 18, was signing up with him. She was checked every month, and sometimes twice a month, even though there was no need for it. Of course, Max took her in, listened to her, examined her, even though he sincerely didn't understand such an obsessive desire to control her health. Tiffany, that was the name of the guy's regular patient, had made an appointment with him again, despite having been to see him only a couple weeks ago. When he saw her appointment, he wasn't surprised at all, just smiled wryly. She was the last one at the appointment that working day, so Max was already prepared for hours of questions about her state of health and how to choose the right partner. But he couldn't imagine how this next meeting would actually end and what his interest in the beautiful patient would lead to. On this day, Tiffany looked especially attractive. She wore a short dress, made an expressive makeup, and it seemed that she was going not to the doctor's office, but to a date where she was sure to please her chosen one. Sitting down on a chair near the doctor, she immediately noticed his interested look and smugly replied, "Yes, I dressed up today especially for you. I see you liked my outfit too, didn't you?" She leaned on the table, looking carefully at the man and noticing his uncomprehending gaze. "But you told me that you like it when girls dress expressively, that it makes them look feminine and attractive in men's eyes. Remember, at the last reception? So I decided to take your advice to attract the attention of a man I like. And judging by your reaction, I'm doing a pretty good job of it, didn't I?" Her gaze became more languid, more playful. She didn't take it away from Max, but he only mumbled, "I'm very flattered that you've decided to make a good impression on me, and admittedly you have succeeded. But I'm not interested in a relationship at work. I'm sorry, is something bothering you? Or did you just want to show me how attractive you can be?" Max smiled, not realizing what awaited him in the future. He looked at the girl carefully as she leaned back in her chair. Tiffany spoke in a confident voice. "You know, I was sure you'd be impossible to meet anywhere but the hospital. And I was right about that, wasn't I? I have to make an appointment to talk to you. That's why I'm here." Her gaze became more predatory again. She licked her lips in a languorous voice. "I'd like to invite you to my home. We could have a great time. You could get to know my inner world better." She looked at the man carefully, expecting a positive answer. For a few seconds, Max sat in confusion as Tiffany suddenly added, "No serious relationship. Don't think I'm not really interested in such an option myself. I just want to have a good time. With a handsome man like you, one meeting. And then it's every man for himself." Max hesitated, but after a couple more persuasions he agreed. But if he'd known how it would end. Tiffany left the guy her address. They agreed to meet in a couple weeks after work. Max was looking forward to the meeting, already anticipating a great time. But fate had completely different plans for that evening. The guy did not prepare for the evening. He only chose a less decent outfit and styled his hair to look more attractive in the eyes of the girl. At some point in his head flashed the thought that he should take flowers, but he immediately dismissed it. She had invited him. She had insisted on meeting him. Why should he spend money on her, and why should he try to please her? Standing by the door, Max blamed himself for coming empty-handed, but there was nowhere to go. He rang the bell, but there was no answer. Reaching for the bell to ring again, he heard a strange rustling outside the door and opened it himself. Standing before him was a man who looked painfully similar to his father. He stared at Max absent-mindedly, never taking his eyes off him. Tears glistened in the corners of his eyes, but the boy could not be broken by such things. He looked at the man carefully and asked with incomprehension, "I apologize, but this is Tiffany's address. She left it for me a few days ago and we made an appointment. I may have just gotten the house mixed up." He spoke calmly, though a storm was brewing in his soul. Could there really be people so alike? Or had his father been so close to him all this time? The man stood silent, as if he didn't know what to say either. The silence was becoming tense, so he abruptly walked over to the boy and enclosed him in his arms. "Son, I thought I would never see you again in my life," whispered the man. Max opened his eyes in surprise, not realizing how this could be. He tried for a few seconds to figure out what was going on, and then sharply pushed the man away from him. Looking at him hatefully, he stated, "I don't have a father. That man left me as a child, and I have no idea how his life turned out. But I'm sure that if he lived just a few blocks away from me, he would have surely found the courage to meet me sooner." Max turned around abruptly, intending to walk away, but at that moment he felt a firm hand on his wrist. Abruptly turning around, he looked at the man with hatred, not understanding what the man wanted from him. "Let go of my hand immediately or I'll call the police." Max jerked, but he couldn't break free. He wanted to continue resisting as Tiffany suddenly appeared behind the man's back. She looked at Max sympathetically, speaking, "I'm sorry that your life turned out this way, but you really should listen to him. He'll tell you a lot of things you don't even realize." Max looked at the girl with incomprehension. For a few seconds he doubted the correctness of his next decision, but still he entered the house and agreed to listen to his father. But would he have known what he was about to learn? Max's father told him that for years he had been trying to get in touch. He had called, sent messages and even letters, but they had all gone unanswered. He came home to his former spouse to try to reconcile, to return the relationship. But everything was unsuccessful. She didn't believe in his words. And after a while she filed a petition in court to limit Max's communication with his father. She cried all the time of the meeting, inventing horrible stories, which were not really. As a result, the judge issued a ruling on the basis of which the man could not go near his own son. He showed Max the conclusion of the court to prove his words, showed numerous messages that were sent every year with a plea to allow him to communicate with the child. The man talked for a long time about how difficult it was for him all these years, how he missed and looked for all possible ways to see Max. He even spent 6 months behind bars for violating court requirements, after numerous attempts to socialize with his son at school. It all seemed unrealistic, but the overwhelming evidence said otherwise. "I realize you don't have to believe me, but it's the truth." "In conclusion," the man said, sighing heavily. Max took a few minutes to comprehend everything that had happened, after which he asked with bewilderment, "But what's your connection to her?" He pointed at Tiffany, who had been standing next to him the whole time. "And this is your sister." I tried to find solace in another woman, but the experience was no less sad. He sighed heavily, closing his eyes. This was the unexpected way Max's life had turned out. It would still take him a long time to understand and accept his father. But the feeling that he now had family in his world warmed his soul and gave him hope for a better future.